essays work. Now, we'll do a quick recap of the basics of essays. So, firstly, how essays work is you're given two things. So, you're given a prompt. So, the topic, in other words, is just a one sentence sort of like this is a one line, sort of like encapsulating what the topic's about, right? And this one sentence, this one line determines the direction or the trajectory of your essay. So, your combination of paragraphs, your contention, your entire essay is focused on this one line, this prompt here. So, this one sentence. And in order to support that, Vika, your teacher, will also give you some stimulus material as well, right? So, this stimulus material, in other words, it's just like a hint, right? It's just a bunch of hints given by the examiner, right? So the examiner sort of like gives you a few hints regarding what they want you to talk about. That's what the stimulus is for, right? So if you ever stuck, if you ever can't think of body paragraph ideas, I encourage you to have a look at the stimulus. Try to generate ideas based on that, right? And the stimulus could be anything. It could be a linguist quote. It could be like a visual like this. It could be a meme. We've seen that sometimes. Literally anything, right? And you can use that as part of your essay, right? You can incorporate that into your essay. And it's actually compulsory to do so as well. So it's compulsory to engage with the stimulus as well. So it's both a hint that's given by the examiner and that allows you to like think of body paragraph ideas, and it's also a compulsory part of your essay as well. So that's basically all you need to know in terms of like the anatomy of essay topics and like how they're formatted and how they're presented to you. So this is the prompt, which is your main priority. And in order to support that, in order to support the ideas of the paragraphs that you're using to address the prompt, they also give you sentence material as well. So it will look something like this, right? The prompts at the top, and then so in order to support that, they also give you a bunch of stimulus materials. Now, hopefully, we're all clear on like the format or the presentation of essays in the SACs or in your SACs and in the exam as well. For the exam, they'll give you three essay topics. So they'll give you three of these. So three essay topics for you to choose from, and you only need to select one. So you only need to choose one topic and just answer that. So it's pretty good in that regard. Now, contemporary media examples. These are basically the building blocks of essays, right? So when it comes to ACs and SAQs, you're given a text, right? And your examples, the bulk of your SAQs, the bulk of your ACs, uh, are just like analyzing those examples. You're just gonna like source a bunch of examples from the text that Vika provides or your teacher provides and analyze those. You're gonna analyze them using, the block structure that I taught you, meta language, effect, link, whatever, right? When it comes to essays, on the other hand, you're not given a text. So as we touched on earlier, you have to bring in your own examples. I call them contemporary media examples, right? So these are the building blocks of your essays. So instead of using something from a text as a building block for your essay, you bring in your own examples, right? Um, Now, the thing is, these are called contemporary media examples because they must be within one calendar year of your exam dates. So that means your sort of cutoff is October 2025. So your examples must be from October 2025 onwards, um, until like, October 2026, whenever your exam is. So you're actually like officially like not allowed to use examples before that. So that's like the restriction that VCAL gives you. And it's also why they call it contemporary media examples. It can be penalized if you use like really old examples as well. So like what I'll do right here is as these examples sort of come up, right, in the media, on the news, etc., I'll send them to you guys. So we'll do it in the classes. I'll do it, through Discord as well. So if you look at the Discord server, I'll like make a channel there for essay examples, and I'm gonna show you guys, how to actually elaborate on each example, what you can talk about, and that will like, give you something that you can put into your example bank or your portfolio of examples, your paragraphs. So I'll give you quite a few examples right there, right? And we'll also go through a bunch of examples in the modules as well. So over the next few weeks, we're going to be doing a bunch of modules for all the essay themes that I'm going to teach you for formal language for Unit 3 Aerosol 2. And in each of those modules, I'm going to teach you like the actual theme itself. So, for example, doublespeak, and we'll go into a few practice essay topics that are relevant to that theme, and I'll give you a few examples as well that you can incorporate into your paragraphs for that theme. So, those modules will be very high yield. Now, very important that you don't like to simply source your paragraphs. So you don't simply source your examples from example banks, because I know like you might find them like on the internet or something. But if you like just search up like examples, right? Like English examples, you might come across like really old examples, and you might come across these example banks. Um, that some people might provide. You want to be very careful. You want to be like extremely cautious whenever you're using this, because the thing is, most of the examples that they use in these example banks are actually outdated. So they don't fulfill the criteria that VCAR, gives you for essay examples. They're actually not contemporary. So you can lose a lot of marks if you use those examples. So yeah, be very careful regarding that. Um, and also, all the examples I give you are going to be very high quality as well. So remember, it's quality over quantity. It's better to have like, 30 really good examples than to have like 100, mediocre examples. So yeah, focus on quality over quantity. Now, are we sort of all clear on like how media examples work and like, how to incorporate them into your essays and like, how to find them, etc. Any questions regarding that? Okay, if an example like 6.7 was created much before October 2025, but it's still relevant today, can I use it? Okay, good question. Good question. To answer this question, you must find um, an instance of this example, so 6.7, being used after October 2025, right? And I'm sure there will be many instances, but you must find like, a salient instance of 6.7 being used. So like maybe it's being used by a politician or a prominent public figure. And yeah, as long as you can do that, it should be okay. But yeah, the thing is your examples have to be from like after October 2025. Otherwise, like you can get penalized for that. Yeah, okay, no worries at all. All good, all good. So yeah, I'm gonna show you guys like how to actually elaborate on these examples. So when you're preparing like an example bank, when you're preparing your portfolio of examples, your paragraphs, right? This magic list that I get you guys prepared. You want to like also elaborate on each example. You want to have an idea of what you're going to talk about for each example. And you don't just want to like make a list of examples, right? So don't just like find a bunch of examples and like just not elaborate on them, like not sort of like think about how you're going to talk about each one in the essay, right? You want to make sure you have a general overview of what you're going to discuss for each example, how you're going to elaborate on each example, so that, when you do your essay and when you actually do your SACRI exam, it's not going to be that hard. You don't have to like think on the spot. So when you're actually elaborating on examples, right? Like we do this in our blank paragraphs and essays, but when you're elaborating on it, when you're explaining them, when you're analyzing them, there's a structure that we use, right? Now, this is a bit different to the structure that I teach for ACs and SAQs. So when I was teaching ACs and SAQs, do you guys remember the structure that I gave you guys to use whenever you're analyzing an example? So what's our structure there? Like whenever you analyze any example for ACs and SAQs, what approach do we use? Like what's our structure? So what's the first step? Yeah, male language. Yeah, okay, exactly. Yeah, male language effect. Yeah. And obviously quote the example, line number, whatever, right? And you explain the immediate effect of the example. So what does the example do? And then you link it to an SLV, right? So for example, function, purpose, register, whatever, right? So this is the approach I use for ACs and SAQs. However, when it comes to essays, your structure is going to be a bit different. So for essays, there's a different structure we use, and I did briefly go over it when I did the basics of essays in a previous module. But does anyone know, like, does anyone remember like the approach or the structure that we use? Okay, well, what is the SLV? So SLV stands for sociolinguistic variable. Another word for it is contextual factor. So your teacher might also use this word as well. So has a teacher used the word contextual factor before, or like, do they say like social linguistic variable? Because they, yeah, okay. They haven't? Okay. So the thing is, right, when it comes to Erlang, um, you analyze like a feature, right, in an AC or SAQ, and you link it to one of these things, right? So you link it to an SLV, right? Also known as a contextual factor. So this includes things like function, purpose, register, tenor, intent, cultural context, right? These are all concepts. These are all big picture ideas that we link to, right? So in simple terms, SLVs just mean like big picture ideas. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. And it will make more sense, yeah, like when we actually delve into like, a few practice texts in like more detail. But yeah, like that's how ACs and SAQs work in terms of elaborations, in terms of structure. But when it comes to essays, our approach is a little bit different. So, can anyone tell me, when you're elaborating on your example in your essay, let's say you're addressing an essay topic. Let's just say you're answering this topic, right? You're writing an essay for this topic, right? You have an introduction, three body paragraphs, conclusion. Now, in your body paragraphs, because it's an essay, you're going to be introducing your own examples. You're going to be using your own examples to answer a topic, right? And it's going to be two examples per paragraph. And I'll go into that structure in more detail very soon. But how do we actually elaborate on these examples? Like, what exactly do we do? Like, any ideas as to, like how might you like start off your elaboration in an essay, for example? So, what would our first step be? Any ideas? Yeah, exactly, exactly. Yeah. So the first step, okay, obviously topic sentence, right? Like that's part of our paragraph. But in terms of the actual example itself, right? Um, our first step is gonna be to contextualize the example. Now, why do we do this? Well, the thing is, when it comes to essays, you're like introducing your own examples. You're showing the examiner something that you found, like through your own research. And the examiner hasn't seen this example before. So if they're marking it AC or SAQ, they know exactly what example you're referring to because they've seen the text before. They know all the examples inside out. They've read like 100 ACs for that same text, right? But for essays, because you're introducing your own examples, the examiner has no idea what your example is about. So you got to contextualize it. You got to give the examiner a bit of background information regarding, what your example is about. So, who was the example used by? When was it used, right? Where was it used? Uh, in what context was it used? Was it public, private, etc., right? Like you want to contextualize it just enough for the examiner to understand the rest of your elaboration, right? The actual analysis. That's all, right? So it doesn't have to be too long. Your goal is to just convey to the examiner, uh, like what you need to know to actually understand your elaboration. And as long as you can do that, you're good to go, right? Um, so that's the first step. You always want to contextualize the example. Otherwise, if you just go straight into the example itself, they're not going to have any ideas to like, what the example's about, who was it used by, etc., right? So yeah, contextualize it first, right? And what comes next after that? So after you've contextualized the example, given a bit of background information, what do we do next? So we introduce the actual example, right? And when we're doing that, what must we include? Yeah, exactly. Meta language. Yeah. So you want to label the example with meta language. So it would be something like, for example, in your October or like in December 2025, Anthony Albanese used the slang cardinal, 6, 7, right? And then you like go into your elaboration, right? So you just contextualize it and you introduce the example and you label that example with meta language. So that's your first sort of like, that's how you start off your elaboration. So you introduce the example itself, right? Now, what comes next? So what's the next natural thing that comes after your male language? So whenever you have male language, you also have something else. Yeah, exactly. The effect, right? So you explain the immediate effect, the immediate impact uh, of the example. So, what does that slang term do? What does, this example of doublespeak actually do, right? What's the immediate effect? And it's usually linked to the male language. So if the male language is, for example, jargon, the effect might be that it lends an air of erudition, or it lends an air of credence or authority, expertise, whatever, right? So you want to explain the immediate effect. Now, those are our first three steps for essays, right? When you're like elaborating on an example, so when you're analyzing an example. But what comes next after that? There's two more steps that you got to follow whenever you analyze an essay example. Can anyone tell me what those are? So, like, we'll start with the next one after that. Okay, I think it's a bit tricky, but I'll give you a hint, right? It has to do with Unit 3. So, does anyone remember what Unit 3 is called? It's called language variation and something. Not register. It's called language variation and purpose. Yeah, that's the name for Unit 3. So, there is like there's a reason we actually like there's a reason Vika has called it that, and that's because the focus of Unit 3 is the idea of purpose, right? And that means whenever you do an essay for Unit 3, you want to incorporate an analysis of purpose into every example, right? So you want to link your example to a purpose, right? Uh, and you want to look at the studies line for this. So if you go to the studies line, go to the dot points for Unit 3. So Unit 3 RSA 1, Unit 3 RSA 2. VCAR will provide you like a bunch of purposes for both formal language and informal language. And you want to just link your example to one of those purposes. So for example, one purpose might be like, in-group membership, could be promote social harmony, could be face needs, right? Positive, negative face needs, could be to obfuscate, whatever that purpose is, right? Just have a look at their study design. There's going to be a bunch of purposes given there, but you just link to one of the purposes from a study design. So it's important because it's part of like what Unit 3 is all about. Unit 3 is all about language variation and purpose. So you sort of like fulfilling the requirements of the study design there. Now, what's our last step? This is what makes you stand out. Does anyone know what it is? Okay. Link close. I mean, like your link actually has to like be incorporated throughout your entire elaboration. So your link is sort of like um implicitly incorporated into your elaboration, and we do it by referencing keywords from the topic. So that's important. But the final step for your example elaboration, whenever you're analyzing an essay example, is to include something called a social application, right? Now, what do I mean by this? Well, this just means like the broader, like societal level um impact, right, of the example. So what does the example do on a broader scale, right? So like for example, in the case of say like, Australian slang, right? If you use Australian slang, like what's the broader societal level impact of that? Well, it allows you to preserve our culture. It allows you to preserve, national values, Australian values, right? Larrikinism, egalitarianism, resilience, mateship, whatever, right? For many generations to come, right? Or if you're talking about, say, like double speak, right? You can talk about how the broader societal level impact is that it undermines, the rapport between everyday people and large corporations or large public figures, right? So that's what I mean when I say social implication. It's just like the broader societal level impact of using the example, right? And a good way to sort of start, like a good way to phrase it is by saying like, if you know, if such, like blah blah, right? Like could be jargon or like double speak or whatever continues, you know, then this will happen, right? So this is a good way to sort of like phrase, to like word your social implication. Could I give an example of that? Yeah, sure. So like in the case of say like let's say I'm talking about discriminatory language. If I was let's say I'm talking about racist language. Let's just say that's like one of my paragraphs, right, for an essay topic, and I want to analyze the example as part of my essay. I want to link that example to a social implication. I want to talk about the broader societal level impact of that example, right? So how might I talk about that? Well, I can say something like, if such, or should such, like racist or like, xenophobic rhetoric persist in public discourse, it may, undermine social cohesion, right? And escalate, you know, um, escalate uh racial tensions based by, uh blah blah like XYZ diaspora, right? So that's just an example of a social application, right? It's just like the broader societal level impacts of the example. And the reason we do this is because it helps you stand out, right? Helps you distinguish yourself from other people doing their essay, right? Because the thing is, most students would stop here, right? Sometimes they might stop here, right? And their elaboration would sound like any other elaboration, right? But what the examiners want you to actually like discuss, right? Like I've seen the rubric. Like my teacher was a VK examiner, and he actually showed us the rubric that VK uses to mark essays. And as part of the rubric, what they wanted to see in the responses was like an interpretation of the societal level impact, like the broader impact of the example, right, on society, right? Uh, like on our like social fabric. So like you want to talk about like the broader impact of the example. That's what they're looking for. That's what Inglang's all about, right? The whole reason we study Inglang is that we want to like learn about how language affects society. And this is how you do that. This is how you like actually like use your knowledge, to like, do that in the first place. So yeah, that's why it's important to do that. Um, but hopefully that kind of makes sense in terms of what I mean when I say social implication. But this is the five-step approach that you got to follow. Like whenever you elaborate on a media example for unit three, you gotta follow this five-step approach. For unit four, it's the exact same, except step four is different. So for unit four, because it's about language variation and identity, it's a bit different in terms of like, what we link to here. But other than that, it's basically the same thing. I'll teach you like what it is later when we get to unit four. But whenever you like find an example, over the next few weeks for one of the paragraphs, you want to follow this structure here. You want to try to elaborate on that example using the structure that I've given here, and also make sure you get it checked with me so I can tweak it, I can adjust it, and make sure it's good to go for your SAC or for your exam. And how does this fit in? Right. So how does this fit in into like our essay structure, right? So I know like one of you asked you this question a couple of minutes ago, so I do want to answer that. So like why am I teaching you this? Like how do I actually incorporate this into my essay? Well, your essay is structured like this, right? So firstly you start off with the introduction. So you talk about like, your contention, you address the topic, you unpack the topic, you signpost the body paragraphs, right? And we want two or three body paragraphs, paragraph one, paragraph two, paragraph three, and you finish off with a conclusion, which just reiterates your contention, summarizes your three-way paragraph ideas, and concludes the essay on a positive note. So how do we fit this into our essay? Well, basically, every body paragraph is gonna incorporate two examples, right? So you're gonna analyze two examples per body paragraph. So example one and example two, right? For each body paragraph. Now, whenever you analyze these examples, you want to follow this same structure, right? This exact structure that I've just taught you guys. Now, obviously, there's more to the body paragraphs. So you obviously like you have things like topic sentences, preludes, link sentences, transition sentences, bridge sentences, and I'll teach you that very soon in this module. But just as a general overview, every body paragraph has two examples, and you elaborate on each of those examples using this approach here. Okay, can I use the example, like the same example in different body paragraphs? No, unfortunately not. So you have to use different examples. So that's why we prepare a lot of examples for like each of our body paragraphs, because like we don't want to like repeat the same example, right? In our essay. So each of these examples should be different. So you won't really need to repeat it either because you prepare around like 40-ish examples, 40, 50 examples by the end of the year, and you only need to select six. So you won't really like feel the need to, like repeat examples, right? As long as you like, prepare the paragraphs, follow everything I say, you should be okay. And also, if you repeat examples, it's like it makes your essay repetitive as well, which is not good. Okay. Hopefully that clears things up for the student who asked about like, how it fits into essay structure. But do you have any further questions, any follow-up questions regarding that?